Good morning, everybody. Time is now 9:30, so I'm going to resume the hearing into the examination. Everybody ready? Everybody hear me? Okay. Yep, got some thumbs up. Excellent, thank you. Yes, I can see everybody's here now. Right. Now, this is a continuation of Matter 11B, the discussions that we had back in March. I will go round and just do introductions because it has been a while since everybody was in this session. I don't think there is anybody necessarily new in the session. So I'm not going to do any introductory elements, only that we'll be having breaks as appropriate. We'll have a break mid-morning, lunch, and then if we do go into this afternoon, obviously we will have break mid-afternoon as well. So my name's Yvonne Wright. I'm one of the inspectors who's been appointed to examine this local plan. Can I start with the council then, please, just to introduce yourselves? Mr. Russell?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Mark Russell, Head of Planning Strategy and Economic Development at the District Council. I'll be also calling upon Conrad Moore, who's Principal Planning Strategy Officer. And we have support from Chris Carter from ACOM on transport matters, but that's purely for the first hour, which I mentioned yesterday. And we also have Alex Horton from Arup, who prepared the IDP for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then I'll do, as I've done previously, I will go down the list of participants that I'm expecting to be here. So hopefully everybody is here. Mr. Drover, Gloucestershire County Council. Yep, I can see you.
Morning, ma'am. Yeah, Nathan Drover, Highways Development Manager. I've got Lee Holdman, Claudia Curry, and Louisa Santaywood. Thanks.
Thank you. National Highways, please.
Good morning, ma'am. I'm Lisa McCaffrey from National Highways, Southwest Regional Planning Manager, and I'm also joined today by with Mr. Andy Bill from WSP.
Thank you. Councillor Jones.
Good morning, ma'am. Good morning, everyone. I'm the District Councillor for the Berkeley Vale Ward.
Thank you very much. The representatives for Taylor Wimpey, please.
Yes, good morning, ma'am. Connor Flanagan, Black Box Planning on behalf of Taylor Wimpey, and with me I have James Darrell, Transport Director at Transport Planning Associates.
Thank you. And the representatives for Sharpness and Ecotricity, please.
Morning, ma'am. It's Paul Fong from Morgan Elliott Planning, representing Sharpness and Ecotricity, and today I have Chris Long from Ridge and Lee Stolworthy from Stantec.
Thank you. And the representatives for Persimmon Homes, Severn Valley, please. Are they in the room?
He's just emailed me to say that he doesn't. They
talking with who's representing your group?
No.
Okay.
Oh, I thought there was a. Oh, maybe it's just the parish council. I had an email from Andy to say that there was a transport. Chris was.
Yes, parish council.
Oh, right.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'll come to the Slimbridge Parish Council now.
Yeah, sorry for the confusion.
That's fine.
Yes, Chris Miles White Transport, as you say, representing Slimbridge Parish Council.
Great, thank you. Tritech Symmetry, please, representative.
Morning, ma'am. It's Tim Partridge. On the basis it's just questions 7 to 14, which your programme says, then I won't take part any further today, but I asked Charlotte to put my name down for tomorrow.
Okay, that's fine. We will be having a small discussion on local transport issues before we move on to the actual policies.
Okay.
That's going to be the first hour, it may not even take first hour. It may only be 10 minutes for all I know. I want to open, so whether you want to stay just to see how the first section goes, and then it will just be discussion about the policies. There won't be anything further.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay. The representatives for L&Q Estates, please.
Good morning, ma'am. Yes, it's Neil Brandt from Neil Brandt Consulting, as you say, on behalf of L&Q Estates at Warden.
Thank you. And have I got representative of CAM Community Action Group? I have got a note on here that they may not be able to attend. So
yes, I don't think they're going to be able to.
They're not going to. That's fine.
They might try this afternoon, perhaps.
Okay. I'm not anticipating we go into this afternoon, but I've said that before. So let's see how it goes. Representatives for Redrow Homes, please.
Good morning, Emma Fortune from Carney Sweeney representing Redrow Homes. Today I'm also joined by Redrow's Highways consultant Tom Payne from PFA Consulting.
Good morning, ma'am.
Thank you. Representatives for Robert Hitchens, please.
Morning, ma'am. Sarah Hamilton-Point from Pegasus Group, and I'm also joined by Julian Alexander from PFA.
Thank you.
To do with transport matters. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I'm not sure if Hamfallow Parish Council are present. There's a question mark on my list. Not sure if they are able to attend. No,
they haven't joined this morning.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. They may wait for the relevant site allocation sections, because that's where nitty-gritty of dealing with transport issues at a site-specific level can be raised, obviously. Thank you for that. That's really helpful to just run through exactly who is here. Now, the session today is a continuation of the previous session that we've had on 11B on transport. Now, I'm not proposing a repetition of what we discussed back in March, and I do want this session to focus on local transport infrastructure as set out on the hearing programme. This is about focusing on local transport infrastructure and the policy questions, which are 7 to 14 in our MIQs. So be prepared, because we will be getting down to the nitty-gritty of what the policies are actually trying to achieve. So I do have some queries and questions on that, as I'm sure you've learned that I'm quite pedantic on policy wording. So our previous session focused more on strategic transport infrastructure and strategic matters relating to transport. And we had quite a long session on deliverability and viability as part of that day, where we were discussing strategic transport infrastructure. Now, as part of that, there was some discussion on strategic infrastructure requirements, how that would be implemented, and we also had discussions on interventions that are set out in the Sustainable Transport Strategy. There was also some discussions on the traffic forecasting report, the modelling that's been used, transport funding delivery plan. All of those elements were discussed, and I don't propose to repeat what was discussed back then. So in reference to the strategic sites, or I know we tried to steer clear of some strategic site matters. Obviously, it was important that we discussed some, but obviously site allocation matters will be discussed when we come to relevant site allocations in more detail. However, first of all, as part of this session, I wanted to give the opportunity to discuss any local transport infrastructure issues and concerns, notwithstanding, again, I'll repeat, that we will have there will be an opportunity to discuss specific site-related matters at the site's allocation sessions under matter 6. So that's what I wanted to start off with. And I am going to, because obviously there were some elements that were mentioned yesterday where concerns were raised about the methodology that's been used. I know we have had a discussion about that because that was part of the original, the first 11B session. But I wanted to understand whether this was a different issue in relation to, because I know it was Mr. Miles who raised an issue about the methodology relating to the evidence that backs up the council's transport case. So I just want to ensure that I fully understand exactly the issues that have been raised in relation to these aspects. So I'm literally going to be just opening the floor here because I haven't got an agenda, and I'm not going to go through any specific questions in relation to local transport. This is an opportunity for just anybody to raise any particular concerns about the evidence in relation to overall local infrastructure issues. Mr. Partridge, I see that you've got your hand up.
Yeah, and I know I said I was going to take part. It's a question really. At the first 11B session, you asked the councils for a delivery document for how the motorway junctions were going to be provided. Has that been produced?
That hasn't been provided yet, no. Mr. Russell yesterday, and I don't want to put words into Mr. Russell's mouth, but said that a note was being produced, but it hasn't been finalised yet. It's on its, I think he mentioned it was on its 3rd draft or so forth. So it hasn't been produced yet. So we are still waiting for that.
And will there be an opportunity to discuss that at a future hearing?
We need to see exactly what it says first in terms of, because myself and my colleague need to see what direction we're going on this.
But it will be a public document at some stage.
Oh, absolutely. No, it'll be made public, but whether we want further comments on it, or whether we go, no, this isn't acceptable, we need further evidence, or we need you to go away and you need to do this.
No, understood.
So it may be, will be certainly made available and made public as soon as we've seen it and considered it, but it's not there yet. And I've not seen anything. So
okay, and then just lastly, you mentioned that this session is about local roads rather than strategic roads. At the 11B session, we did talk about the B4008 dualling and its connection into junction 12. So I assume we don't need to cover that now.
No, because we did cover that then, unless there is anything in addition that you just want to mention, but we did mention it as part of that discussion.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So whenever, Mr. Partridge, I know you said you weren't quite sure whether to stick around or whatever. If you need to go, just go whenever. Okay.
Thank you.
That was far too many use of the word whenever then, but never mind. Right. Anybody else have any? Oh, Mr. Miles, I was just about to bring you in because you raised some concerns yesterday when we are obviously focusing on the 2 new settlements.
Indeed. Excuse me. My main concern is the assumptions that have been used within the sustainable transport strategy, which have then followed through into the traffic forecasting report. If you look at Winslow in isolation, let's take the A4135 corridor, for instance. That's identified as being upgraded to a sustainable transport corridor. My question is, can it be improved to the degree that sort of warrants a 15% modal shift that's allowed within the STS and the TFR? I would say, having walked that route, there's little ability to. Well, let's start at the Winslow end and walk in towards Cam. you're on a big high embankment. There's very little ability to actually widen into the verge to create a shared footway, cycleway of any particular standard. And while we're talking about that embankment, it also causes a big internalisation effect, of course, within Winslow as a whole. It's a barrier between the north and south section. But continuing on in towards Cam, you've got a very narrow bridge over the railway. The footway is less than 1 metre wide. The ability to improve that is limited. The only thing you could really do is spend a lot of money by putting another sort of footway cycleway to the side of that bridge. Continuing again towards Cam, there's lots of side road junctions, priority junctions, mini roundabouts, traffic signals. The road space available, there's very little ability to widen in places. There's on-street parking, there's even on-footway parking. We got new junctions coming into play through PS24 if that ever sort of comes forward. So the ability to do anything significant to that corridor or anything that could warrant a 15% modal shift, I just can't see that that's deliverable. So that's my sort of main concern, in that there's no evidence to link what can physically be done on site to the modal shifts that have been applied.
So I suppose so you're querying how the reduction, the 15% has been, are you querying how the 15% has been calculated in relation to, I know that said the documents are, the evidence is sort of more high level, because that's what's here for the plan. So I'm trying to understand exactly what your point is.
Well, the Sustainable Transport Strategy identifies that corridor as pedestrian cycle improvements, plus infrastructure improvements, plus service frequency.
Right. So you're saying there isn't the space to do that.
Can those be delivered? And if they can't be delivered, can you then rely
then you're
on
not going to
modal
get the
shift that's been
15%.
applied?
Okay. So you're saying it should be actually in the assessment, it should be lower, and that would feed in to the TFR.
Yes.
Which would then come out with a different conclusions.
And
that's what you're saying.
That same query, that same approach applies to the bridge over the railway to get to the station, because 15% is being applied to that. We've only got one train an hour coming through Cam and Dursley at the moment. That's not going to be overly attractive in terms of a draw. So the bridge is only one part of the equation. Are the rail services going to be improved sufficiently to encourage that sort of modal shift? Can the council guarantee, can the promoters guarantee that will be delivered in an appropriate timescale? It's just those sort of queries about exactly how much reliance can be put on those modal shift assumptions, given the difficulties associated with delivering the relative improvements.
Okay, thank you. I've got a couple of other hands up. So I know I've got Mr. Carter, who's obviously on behalf of the council. Mr. Choke, shall I bring you in first, or is yours in relation to this issue?
It is, and it was just to throw my support behind Mr. Marder's comments, essentially, that the figures used in the sustainability assessment do appear arbitrary. They move from 10% in the original version to 15%. And I did note Mr. Russell's comment in the session yesterday that they felt that could be as high as 20%. there doesn't appear to be any detailed consideration to derive those percentages, but they do appear to be absent of consideration of likely distribution of trips. We need to consider where trips are going to in the round and the distance and then the quality of infrastructure available. To suggest that 15% of trips and almost 20%, if you take Mr. Russell's word, would be transferred to other modes is ambitious without any evidence, particularly given some of the locational characteristics of different sites. And ma'am, this picks up on a comment I made in the last transport session about a vision-led strategy that is obviously being promoted through the local plan itself, which refers to infrastructure as a last resort. Other alternatives need to be investigated, and that aligns with the National Highway Circular released at the end of last year as well. Again, I agree with Mr. Miles that if that evidence is prepared and shows a different set of conclusions, that has direct bearings on residual traffic movements and the need for infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Carter.
Okay. I mean, thank you both for your views. There's a few slightly different and slightly conflicting points in here, so I just thought I'll start off by addressing the assumptions within the TFR, and then I'll move on to some of the more specifics on the A4135. So the first point is that the percentage reductions in the TFR are there's two mitigation scenarios within the traffic forecasting report, one of which does not allow for mode shift, and the other one includes high risk and then there's high risk mitigation on top of that, and then there's the sustainable transport reductions on top of that. So National Highways and Gloucestershire were very keen that throughout we were having a core scenario which did not include those assumptions for mode shift. So even if you take that whole set of things away, any of the assumptions on mode shift away, the plan has been found sound. The evidence shows that the plan is deliverable without the mode shift assumptions. Now, we don't want to propose a plan that doesn't have these sustainable transport improvements or these mode shift assumptions. So we're not at all suggesting that would happen, but it's just correcting this misconception that the plan is reliant on it, and the idea that this is that these are arbitrary assumptions. Now, they have changed between one iteration of the sustainable transport strategy and the next, and frankly, that's predominantly due to the passage of time and negotiation and officer turnover. And we as Stroud District Council have always considered that we need an ambitious strategy. And the fact is, unless you actually build quite an extensive multimodal traffic model, which experience in the west of England suggests that runs into millions rather than thousands of pounds in terms of development, there really is relatively limited evidence on what specific mode shift can be achieved. So the approach taken was to, and just to correct it, this does not ignore the distribution of trips. It looks at the specific 15% mode shift along this corridor applies to zones within the Saturn model that are within a short distance of the corridor itself and are within the length of the corridor. So they are trips that would be taken entirely using this corridor, and the measures for the corridor itself will, depending on the specifics, they will be public transport led, which will look at the longer distance trips along the corridor, and there will also be walking and cycling measures that will deal with the shorter distance trips. So there will be that all people along the corridor making those trips will be able to benefit from an increased level of mode choice above the existing corridors. So in that respect, we consider that we are being ambitious, and we are looking for a vision-led strategy. So we are deciding the level of mode shift that we wish to achieve, and then the level of investment required from the strategic sites and the way that mitigation is focused, as is set out through CP13 and the delivery policies, to require development to focus on sustainable transport modes rather than traffic capacity. We feel that that is the way to deliver that. I mean, and to talk about the specifics of the A4135 corridor, we are at plan stage. We are promoting a strategy. We are doing an appropriate level of work to show that there is a strategy that can come forward, and individual sites will need to be developing much more of the detail on how that will come forward. We've heard yesterday about the walking and cycling bridge that Winslow proposed to deliver. That will be a significant benefit for active travel trips for sites to the west of the motorway, and alongside that, we've also heard about there's one train an hour from Cam and Dursley. There will be the Metro West 2 project proposes that increases to 2 trains per hour, which is a pretty reasonable level of service when you consider that it connects Bristol and on the Bristol and Birmingham line. We haven't done extensive work looking at a full corridor study for the A4135. That's something that will come forward through developments as things move forward. But we have got and also a lot of what's being proposed is not necessarily large scale infrastructure along the corridor. It may be in places, but to start with, it includes improvements to bus frequency. And we know that Stagecoach are supportive of this approach to focusing development on bus corridors and improving the service frequency. And we've had representations, which I understand that has been submitted to the examination by Mr. Small of Stagecoach, which includes which is very supportive of improved services, including the number 65 that would use the A4135 and then onwards through Winslow and along the A38. So overall, I think we have a sound approach, which focuses on sustainable transport, and there's enough ability for that to come forward, and with detail to be developed through the development management process.
What's the timescales for Metro West 2?
I don't know off the top of my head. I'm sure I could Google it, but it's, yeah, I don't know off the top of my head. I can Google it now while others are speaking.
That's fine. If you can come back to me on that, that would be. Yeah, I know I've read about Metro West 2. Can't recall if I've read about the timescales attached to that. I'm sure it's probably in there, but if you could
yes, well, I haven't got it to hand, but it's definitely in one of our matters statements.
I know it. Yeah, I know it's been referenced, but I can't recall which one.
It may actually be May, but this year. But I might be wrong. But
Mark, you are right. It is referenced as May 2023, but I don't have an up-to-date kind of knowledge of whether it's actually happened or not.
Okay. That's right. Yeah, May 2023 is referenced in your statement, because I remember reading that now. Now you said it, but one of my questions was, is there an update on that? So has it actually been completed? Is it in place, or has it been delayed, or is there we've only just got into May, so I'm not quite sure when. If you can come back to me on that, that's absolutely fine. Thank you. Mr. Choke.
Thank you, ma'am. I don't want to dwell on it too much, but just to pick up on Mr. Carter's comments, there is, in the approach that he's described, there is an element of pessimism bias within that approach. There is a tension between planning for the worst case car traffic and not taking into account the sustainability travel measures, not least because if that methodology results in the need to improve infrastructure, we know that creates a perverse incentive to drive, which will be counterintuitive to deliver the sustainability measures that they're reliant upon to make it sustainable. There needs to be a better balance. It's not as complicated a methodology as Mr. Carter is supposing in his statement to create some evidence, certainly some better scenario testing that is absent in the appraisal thus far. Indeed, ma'am, we're actually in the process of doing that in relation to PS30 as part of the forthcoming application on that site. And again, this is picking up on the vision-led approach. It is taking into account land uses without the need to build an expensive, time-consuming model. However, irrespective, the local plan, whilst it's not a planning application level of detail, there is a requirement for it to be evidence-based. So to simply say an expensive model would be needed to create evidence to support those assumptions, I don't think is acceptable. There needs to be better support to the figures that have been derived. Thank you.
And Mr. Choke, just you say that there should be better scenario testing. What exactly do you mean by that? What are you saying is missing from the evidence in particular?
Primarily about behavioural responses would be the key thing that is missing at the moment. So one of the things that we are doing within our work is to look at how people are reacting to certain types of infrastructure or public transport provision, how they will respond to changes in bus frequency or journey time reductions. You can get that from census data. You can look at existing patterns of behaviour within the areas that you're looking at and competing or proxy sites, for example, that may represent best practice. That's the approach that we're taking. It's evidential, it's mathematical, but you don't have to take it to the extreme. So again, transport planning is not a science. So the idea of scenario testing it and having low, medium and high response rates would be a better approach to simply say 10%, 15%, 20%.
Thank you. Mr. Butcher, please.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. It was only just the point that Mr. Carter made about the 65 bus. It used to take 28 minutes to get from Winslow to Stroud. It now takes 54 minutes minimum. I just wonder why anybody would want to use it. Thank you.
Is that because the service has been extended or because of congestion?
It's happened because they've basically changed and amalgamated a lot of the routes. Effectively they've cut down on the sort of overall pattern and they've made routes longer.
So it's visiting more areas, therefore
it's completely changed.
Stopping.
It's completely changed the route that goes from Winslow to Stroud.
Right.
And it now takes a nice scenic tour through the country villages, which is okay for a pensioner like me with my past and all the time in the world, but for anybody who seriously wants to make the best use of their time, perhaps on a day off, they're just not going to use it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Carter, please.
Mr. Butcher raises an important point about the attractiveness of bus services, and that is, to be honest, it's one of the reasons, one of the key reasons why why we're choosing this approach to movement corridors and ensuring that we're locking in investment in those corridors to improve bus services and to introduce bus priority measures and other active travel measures to try to get general traffic levels down and to try to improve the situation for buses. So I think we're not likely to be able to address the climate emergency unless we do focus our investment in these approaches. So just coming back on as I don't feel the need to labour the points with Mr. Choke, and I haven't seen the details of his methodology, so I won't go into critiquing it. I think the key thing for us is the proportionality of the evidence base, and Mr. Choke is looking at a planning application for a major strategic site, and we welcome the work that that him and his team are doing. Within the assumptions on mode shift, we did look at some low, medium, high scenarios for investment on the movement corridors. One of them was taken forward for modelling, and I think we also we also accept that there is potentially a level of pessimism bias, because we had to make sure that we had a set of assumptions and data and information on mode shift that could be tested through these scenarios that was acceptable to all parties. And we do welcome the increased level of ambition in being able to increase those percentages. The proof will be in the pudding. The TFR does look at there. I mean, it will be unavoidable that there will be impacts of the plan as a whole on major strategic infrastructure. But what we've also done is we've established the approach through CP13 and EI12 that ensure that when the details of sites coming forward at local level, that they are pushed forward into an accessible, a sustainable transport-led approach. And I note that you've got questions on some of the detail, some of the wording of those policies. I'm just conscious that I'm only around for another 20 minutes, but in advance, I just wanted to draw your attention to the recently examined and adopted Baines Local Plan Partial Update, and the policies were particularly ST1 and ST7, which are comparable with the policies that are being presented here in Stroud in terms of maximising the opportunities for people to be able to travel sustainably, and for mitigation to be focused heavily and initially on achieving that mode shift prior to looking at traffic capacity improvements. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got two more hands up, and then I do want to move to CP13. So just in case there is something that you need to, obviously, because I know you've got to go in 20 minutes. So Mr. Alexander, please, and then I'll come to Mr. Drover.
Thank you, Ma'am. Chair, just looking at the modal shift tables in Appendix A of the addendum STS, I just want to query in terms of the new settlement at Sharpness, that's showing a 20% reduction for direct public transport services to Bristol, Gloucester and employment nodes. That to me seems to be very high given the evidence that's been provided by Stagecoach in terms of the ability for a bus-based public transport provision to Gloucester, Bristol. That 20% that's been reduced for those trips is sort of by far, it's nearly double a lot to some of the other sites, which are actually on the sort of the main movement corridors where the actual commercial bus services operate. It just seems a very high percentage to me, given the evidence that's been put forward by both the local highway authority and Stagecoach.
I will allow Mr. Fong to just respond to that, but I don't want to open up a discussion about Sharpness. We had a discussion on Sharpness yesterday, and we will continue that on another date in June to be confirmed. Mr. Fong, anything you want to just very succinctly
briefly
say?
Yes, I will. Mr. Alexander wasn't present yesterday, so he probably wasn't aware of the conversation. There are more than one modal shift interventions that we set upon yesterday. You are aware of them, Ma'am, which is why the modal shift figures are where they are, and they are confidently put by Stantec. Thank you, Ma'am.
Thank you. Mr. Drover, please.
Thank you, ma'am. Yeah, I think Mr. Carter yesterday talked about the industry moving from predict and provide to decide and provide, and I just want to make so the county council haven't made any comments on Winslow, but I think the sustainable transport reductions and the modelling that arose from that was of its time essentially. The industry has to, we have a climate emergency, we can't keep over forecasting and providing dual carriageways where you need single carriageways, and so that we were at the time accepting strategic modelling with I'm not going to say finger in the air reductions, but they included some optimistic reductions in traffic, and we would have modelled the base case without those reductions as well. But it was of its time, and now Mr. Choke's quite right. We are asking for trajectories using donor sites. So, for example, in the edge of Gloucester, you might pick a site in a more favourable location in Gloucester, or Gloucester best case scenario, to see where where ambitiously you could get to with reduced traffic forecasting. And that's just a matter of fact. Mr. Choke's stuff will probably be out of date in 5 years' time because it's moving so fast. We'll probably be carbon modelling individual developments through to the development management process. So I think, yeah, there is a weakness in that, that shaving off traffic theoretically, but we do test the base case anyway, and things are moving quite fast in the industry.
So do you see any concerns or issues with the evidence as it currently stands in terms of the proportionality of looking at traffic forecasting and strategic transport modelling at a local plan level?
Not in terms of highway mitigation.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Is there anything further anybody wants to raise on just local infrastructure before I move on to the policy element? If anybody wants to raise anything later, they're more than welcome to. Mr. Carter, anything else you want to add at this stage? Or shall we move on to the policies?
I'm happy to move on, Ma'am.
Okay, if we can look at then CP13, which is the core policy on transport. I suppose what the comments that have been put forward as part of the consultation on the plan, the Regulation 19, and the and some of the statements that have come forward. There's concerns have been raised about whether the policy is explicitly clear in what the transport hierarchy is. So that's a bit of an old-fashioned way of saying it, but it's walking first and then cycling and so forth as you go down. Private car at the bottom, literally. Is the policy clear enough on that basis? Because it starts off with we will support, the policy major schemes will be supported where they, and it sets out. Does it clearly set out what the plan is trying to achieve in terms of minimising the need to travel? Is that explicit, or is that explicitly set out elsewhere within the plan? I know it's part of the strategy, and we have had a discussion about, and I know the council is, and I've not opened the document, but I know the council has put forward some potential main modifications for the spatial, because we did have a discussion about bringing a new policy in on the spatial strategy, making that clearer, or amending existing policies to make that clearer. Is that, so I think that's what some of the concerns are, is it sort of almost goes in at, doesn't make it clear from my perspective, or from the local plan perspective, it is clear, but it's within other policies. So I'm trying to understand what this policy is trying to achieve as it's the core policy initially. Because the first thing that it says is provide for a variety of forms of transport as alternatives to the car to allow more sustainable choices, improve the network and mitigate. It doesn't specifically set out this requirement of minimising travel and making it absolutely clear that you've got to go down the transport hierarchy. Any comments on that, Mr. Russell?
Yeah, well, I think you sort of hinted at it in the sense we've already had a session on DCP1, which is the first key policy, and without labouring the point, the very first bullet point is to locate development proximity to essential services and facilities to minimise the need to travel. And then the second bullet point is by prioritising in order of importance walking, cycling and public transport to deliver the highest possible share of trips by the most sustainable travel modes. I'm minded of your previous comments about not repeating in policy wording through the plan. So I think given that we've had that discussion around that policy as being the sort of the font of all the other subsequent policies, which drives forward the overall objectives of the plan, then I would suggest that that's fairly clear. And if you were a development management officer, then you would point to that policy, and then you would look to how would that actually work in practice. You would look at CP13 and EI12, etc., etc. So you'd start from that strategic policy in the development strategy section. Thank you.
So DCP1 relates to all development. This only relates to major schemes. So is that correct then? This core policy only relates to major schemes?
No, the first three.
The first bit, as it
criteria refer
I meant to say
schemes.
the first bit. So.
Yeah. And then if you then look at in all development cases, it then talks about choices in the mode of transport available, which minimise the distance people need to travel.
So there is repetition. So I'm trying to understand what this policy is trying to achieve that isn't already set out, and I will be. And there are issues, well, not issues, but I've got concerns with repetition with other policies, because you've got EI12 and you've also got EI13, where there is some element of there's repetition.
Well, I would sort of look at it the other way. I would suggest that if you think of policy as starting off with the sort of broad objectives, principles, then setting out the more specific policy aspects which relate to that particular type of development, and then you look at the sort of delivery mechanisms, the very detailed points which spill out from that. If you try to do, you can obviously there will be local plans that try to do that in one policy, but it would fundamentally be a different structure of the plan to ours. And I think that approach, which we've rehearsed on other matters, for example, CP15 in terms of countryside policies, and then looking at detailed policies on things like barn conversions, etc. That is the structure that we've taken for this in terms of this local plan. So inevitably there will be an element of duplication in the introduction of the policy, but each policy, the development strategy as the principles for all development, CP13 in terms of development that would have an impact on the highway network and where you want to achieve sustainable travel modes, and then EI12 where you're getting down into a lot more detail about the specific aspects of the transport interventions. You know, that is the approach we've taken. I'm happy to respond to points of where there's clarity or whether there's conflict between policy wording, but fundamentally that's the strategy of the plan as we have it. Well, obviously that's for you to decide how any concerns you might have could be resolved. But I think without fundamentally change, if you change that approach, you have to fundamentally rewrite all the policies, and whether that is proportionate and whether that is achievable and whether it's needed, I think is a matter we would dispute. Thank you.
Mr. Brandt, you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. Just in terms of my input on CP13 and DCP1, regards to 13, I feel that the policy as structured and worded does not properly adopt the hierarchical approach for sustainable transport policy. I think it would be far more helpful if it, in the first instance, acknowledged the role that location and development content takes in terms of minimising the need to travel, which is at the pinnacle of transport planning policy in terms of minimising the need thereby for sustainable transport and the residual road mitigation. So if it were to be restructured so as to emphasise in the first instance, development should seek to minimise that travel by virtue of their location and by virtue of their development content, and then to cascade from there in terms of sustainable transport provision through walking, cycling, public transport, and so on. And my second point is one of, it doesn't seek to apply any weighting of that, because clearly there is embedded carbon in transport provision, whether you're providing a new bus service or providing new infrastructure in terms of a railway line. There is a scale of proportionality there of that embedded carbon in doing that. And in the first instance, it's best to make better use and best use of your existing infrastructure and service, as opposed to building new infrastructure. And again, in terms of that hierarchical approach of the policy reflecting that, so that schemes that can deliver and make best use of the existing services and infrastructure already around them, and to thereby enhance that and get the added benefit of that in terms of the benefit it provides to a wider catchment because other people can use it, should be emphasised through the policy so that it is consistent with DCP1 and the strategic objectives.
I suppose I'm trying to look at the policy in terms of its effectiveness and steering clear of improving the policy, which is a completely different different aspect, and I'm not here to improve. Is the policy effective as it currently stands? It's a bit of a mishmash and a bit all over the place, but is that a soundness issue? Because it starts with major schemes rather than starting with all development should or must, I should say. But does that make it unsound? That's something that I'll need to just consider further as we start to go through some of the other policies as well. And the issue is consistency with wording as well. So it's just ensuring that there is consistency, and I'll raise a couple of things as we move forward. I just want to hear back from the council from Mr. Brandt's suggestion or concerns about realigning sort of what the policy is saying, so putting it in an order and having a hierarchy at the top, etc., whether that's necessary or not in terms of effectiveness of the policy, and then there's no weighting attached in there. So council's response on that. Mr. Carter?
Okay. I mean, I think it's fairly clear in the in the policy itself, in that it basically it says that all development schemes shall. Sorry, I will just read it out exactly. In all development cases, schemes shall be located, so location being the primary matter, where there are or will be choices in the mode of transport available which minimise the distance people need to travel. Now, reducing the need to travel and minimising the distance people need to travel are effectively the same thing, because you can build an entirely new settlement with some houses and some local shops and a school, or you can build and those people who people don't recognise where the red line is. If you're building a small number of houses near an existing school, or you build a large development with houses and a school nearby, they're effectively the same outcome. And the purpose is that you reduce the distance that people need to travel, and therefore you walk and cycle. So that reduction in distance is that the right at the top of the hierarchy, in terms of reducing the need to travel. I then so CP13, I think, as Mark says, it's a core policy. It sets the direction of the plan, and it's very clear with things like development proposals will be expected to consider all possible sustainable transport options before the capacity of the road network is increased, and development schemes proposals should be consistent with and will contribute to the implementation of the agreed transport strategy, etc. You then go on to so as the core policy, it then kind of it is naturally strategic. So you then go to the detailed policy, which is EI 12, which provides significantly more detail on what that actually means from a development management perspective and how it applies to the to each of the as each of the sites come forward. EI 12 refers to the sustainable transport hierarchy. There's very limited debate within the industry and certainly within the local highways authority on what sustainable transport hierarchy actually is. It's also set out within the sustainable transport strategy document itself. So that would be a very easy place to cross-refer to it if there were to be any dispute on what modes would be at the top or in the middle or wherever within the hierarchy. You've also got references within the in the first part of CP13, where we talk about the mode choice, so that the development has to provide for a variety of forms of transport as alternatives to the car. So fundamentally, that needs to, because people will be traveling short, medium and long distances, so those alternatives to the car will need to cover a range of measures across the sustainable transport hierarchy, including shorter distance by walking and wheeling, medium distances by public transport. So ultimately, whilst there may be some repetition between CP13 and EI 12, there is consistency, and there is a clear flow in that you have the core policy, which leads on to the more detailed delivery policy, and then underneath that is a sustainable transport strategy, which guides what that would mean depending on where you are in the district itself, along with GLTP4 as well, which is the county's document to achieve the same effect. Thank you.
I suppose it comes to the point of, if in terms of a developer coming forward and looking at the council's policies, what is this policy trying to achieve? If in order to consider exactly what transport related requirements are in the local plan, this policy doesn't achieve anything, because actually you need to go to the delivery policies. It's almost like, what's the purpose of this policy then? I know you say, well, it's the overarching policy. We've already got an overarching policy, which is DCP1. So then you've got this policy. Then actually, in order to set out the requirements, which is what any developers or any local residents or the decision maker needs to actually determine the application against, it's the later policies. How would a decision maker use this policy to determine whether a developer is in accordance with it? They wouldn't. They'd go to the delivery policies. So therefore, what's the purpose of this policy? That's what I'm trying to get at. I'm trying to understand from a council, but I know you have gone down the route of, we want core policies and then we want like core, you cannot, I've heard them, said as like introductory policies, and then we'll get to the nitty gritty in the delivery policies, which as a system, I'm not against that system at all. There isn't an issue against having a system like that, but I'm trying to understand what the requirements are in the policy, how a decision maker, as I'm a decision maker dealing with appeals, how would I use that policy? Actually, I need to go to other policies to understand this policy, and to actually determine, not to understand it, but to get more meat on the bones, to actually say, okay, what is actually required?
Can I sort of?
Yes, please. Just if you can just try and just explain.
If I can put it another way, let's assume, for the sake of argument, that we had CP13 and we had EI12, and they were put together. They were a single policy. Now, and I've seen many local plans. There are some very long policies which essentially do what we've done by cutting them up. They essentially start with sort of broad principles, and then as you work your way through the policy, there's more and more detailed requirements. There may even be references to supplementary planning documents to actually understand how you're actually going to deliver those policies. What we've essentially done, and notwithstanding any concerns you may have with duplication, unnecessary duplication, or conflict. Clearly, that would be a matter we could look at in terms of detailed wording. What we've essentially done is taken a policy on transport and cut it into, in the case of CP13 and EI12, 2 policies, and we put the principles together under a core policy, and we've identified EI12 as a delivery policy. Now, I can't speak for developers, but I know when I read a planning statement that developers go through the whole plan. They list the policies. They don't go to, the transport requirements, let's go to this policy and we'll ignore everything else. They will set out in often a very long part of the planning statement all of the policies that are relevant in the local plan. You read the plan as a whole, and I have not, and this is hand on heart, I have not had any criticism directed at the fact that transport policies or policies on the countryside are split between core policies and delivery policies, and that has in itself caused any problems. So that's probably. I just wanted to come back. Sorry, before I finish. Yeah. On Mr. Brandt's point about the improving the existing. Yeah. No, it was actually about improving the existing infrastructure before you then look to, and CP13 does. So it talks about looking to provide a variety of sustainable transport choices, and then it talks about in criteria 2 improving the existing infrastructure network. So it does. Before you then look at new bits of kit, which you will find specifically identified in the strategic site policies, it does talk about improving the existing infrastructure network. So, by implication, a development management officer would say, well, how are you enhancing or improving the existing infrastructure network before you consider other site-specific infrastructure measures to achieve your transport goals. So I don't accept that point. Yeah, that was it from me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I chip in and just say I can hang around for 5 minutes, but if there's anything else you would like to ask me specifically, I will need to leave.
No, I need to go through the rest. There could well be, but obviously you need to just go. So
okay,
that's no problem.
I can come back in at 12:30 if that suits, and Mark can send me a message if that's required.
Okay. If there is anything outstanding that Mr. Russell can't respond to, and he says, "Oh, I need, my expert to respond to that," then we can do it either through some written note or some other means. So let's not worry about it too much.
I'm also available all day tomorrow if you wish to roll anything over, but I will take instruction from yourself and Mark.
I just need to be careful because obviously the other participants may wish to hear or be involved in that. So, but thank you for that offer. But you just go when you need to go.
Appreciate that, Ma'am. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. As I said, Mr. Russell, I certainly don't want this to be taken as a criticism of the plan and the way that the council has set out its plan. This is your plan. I've said it before. I think I said it in week 1. All I'm trying to do is understand from a decision maker's perspective, what the policy is trying to achieve in terms of clearly setting out the policy requirements. Now, I hear what you're saying about And I'm not necessarily saying, you know, I've dealt with plans before where there is just one transport policy, and I've dealt with plans where there's several transport related policies. So and it's different, you know, different horses for different courses, etc., as the saying goes. And there is no, it must be done this way. So certainly not a criticism. All I'm trying to get at is this going to achieve what the council wants to achieve? Okay, so I'm just looking at the wording from that perspective. I've got 2 hands up, and then I do have just want to check a little bit on some wording in this policy before we move on to some other policies. So Mr. Drover, and then I'll come to Mr. Clements.
Thank you, ma'am. Yeah, I didn't want to detract from the what is its purpose discussion, but the you mentioned the should must issue and earlier on, and I hadn't actually noticed it before, but the CP13 is actually a shall, which I think a shall should be a must, and EI12 is a should. So I just think they probably do need overhauling of what is actually a must, and I suppose it links into what their purpose is. If you can rely on one to be a should, and the other one is actually an obligation, you can probably cherry pick which one's more favourable. Yeah, but they probably do need a little bit of a review over what is must and what should.
Thank you, Mr. Drover. Mr. Clements?
Yes, it's just a fairly brief point, and not wanting to criticise Mr. Russell's plan.
Sorry, I'm struggling to hear you. I think it's because if you can, yes, be a bit closer to your microphone.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me now. Is that better?
Yes, that's better. Thank you.
Okay. I will. I'll speak a bit more loudly. Not wishing to criticise the plan, but I think I take the point, and I think it's something we've said through our representations at various stages of the plan, that there is a degree of duplication throughout policy.
I am struggling to hear you. It's actually quite a weird sound. I'm not sure if everybody else can hear that. It's quite hard.
I'm struggling as well.
Yeah.
Okay, I apologise.
So I don't know if you have to absolutely face your tablet or your laptop, whatever you've got up, and do not move from that position. No, you're breaking up now. Do you want to turn your camera off and see if the audio alone will make
let me try that.
Will make it easier? You're still breaking up.
Don't worry, it was a general point, picking up some of the points that you made. I don't know whether you can hear me, and I'll speak.
If you keep talking, I can hear you at the moment.
Okay. The point really, and it's continuing Mr. Russell's point, is while there may have been no criticism of developers,
No, I'm sorry, you are cutting out now. I really can't hear you. Can I suggest it might be a case of switch off and switch on back on again to try and see if you can get, or leave the meeting and come back in. Sometimes that.
Ma'am, I'll try that.
If you come that, and then I will come back to you. So please put your hand up again. Okay. Thank you. In the meantime, before we wait for Mr. Clements to come back on, let me just go through the other aspects. And we are getting into some nitty-gritty now of policy wording rather than sort of the specifics. What does the policy mean by to consider? Because to consider isn't an action. Well, it's an action to consider, but what's the outcome of that consideration? And I know then it's, well, actually the specifics are set out in later policies, but is that, because you're asking developers through, bringing their development proposals coming forward to consider all possible sustainable transport solutions. And then you do say, obviously, shall be consistent with and contribute to the implementation of an agreed transport strategy. Is that on the back of is that the outcome that comes out of consideration of all transport options, sustainable transport options? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that proposals need to consider firstly consider all possible sustainable transport options. So that's the first thing, to consider all. So before you come up with specific proposals, to consider, and then in trying to satisfy the policies in terms of all development, if you look at criteria Roman numeral 1, provide choices in the mode of transport available which minimize the distance people need to travel. So the policy requirements are set out above for major developments 1, 2, and 3, and for all developments Roman numerals 1, 2, 3, and 4. And in satisfying the policy criteria, development proposals will be expected to consider all possible sustainable transport options. So in a sense, that paragraph is the how you satisfy those criteria.
The criteria above.
Yes, exactly.
Mr. Drover's point about the policy should say must rather than shall or should. Your comments?
I'm not averse to minor changes if that improves the plan and conformity with the MPPF. If must, well, obviously must is a absolute mandatory requirement, and I would need to look at the subsequent criteria to make sure that the must in those cases does conform with the MPPF. There's no flexibility in the MPPF that we shut off by putting the words must. So as I say, I'm trying to be helpful, and I have no.
No, that's why I wanted that. That's why I wanted your comments.
Yes,
Russell,
I have no problem in principle with that, but I'm just slightly wary because I haven't given it, proper. I haven't cross referred to the MPPF just to make sure that that we're going beyond national policy.
Obviously, myself and my colleague will be looking at that anyway. But if the council can take that away as an action, so not just for this policy, other policies on the transport side, we'll come to other policies as we start to go through them. If you can just give me your comments on that once you've had chance to have a look at that, that'd be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Obviously, my colleague and I will be looking at it from our perspective as well. So thank you for that suggestion. Has Mr. Clements come back in yet? No. I've chucked him out and now he can't get back in. That's a bit unfortunate. Right, well, if he does come back in, we can come back to this. Just final question, well, I think it's a final question on CP13 before we start to move on to some other ones. Or actually, no, there's two, I think there's two questions. Reference is made in the policy to the LTP and to the sustainability transport strategy. Now, I'm always a bit wary when reference is made to documents because documents change or the names of documents change. So it's this is a very sort of pedantic point, and it doesn't mean that anything needs to change. Obviously, there's always a local transport plan. So that's not necessarily a problem because you've not specified a particular local transport plan. They're usually numbered. Are there, so my question is just, will those be updated, or is there any potential for change so that this policy wouldn't be effective in that sense, just from because it makes specific reference to them?
In paragraph 5.16, we do say in cooperation with Highways England, obviously that would need to be changed, and the local highways authority has produced a sustainable transport strategy and traffic forecasting report to accompany the local plan. So I think it's in, so that makes it pretty well, very clear that those documents relate to the documents that were submitted with the local plan, and in terms of supporting the local plan as submitted, and subject to any changes at adoption, that would be clear that those documents were submitted to accompany the local plan. We don't have any I'm minded, I think, relating to things that were mentioned in terms of the infrastructure delivery plan, but I think that's different in the sense that infrastructure can, as we monitor infrastructure and how it's delivered, then that can change over time.
The IDP is different, isn't it?
Yes.
But you don't mention that within the policy.
No, indeed. So
which is good.
and we're certainly not intending, subject to any recommendations, to do any further traffic forecasting in terms of the submission local plan. So my view would be a reader reading that would be very clear that
it would be very clear, because there wouldn't be any updates, there wouldn't be any revisions. Okay, that's fine. I thought that was the case, but that's why I just wanted to just clarify.
Yes, the only documents that we would produce, which would be sort of in addition, are, and I'm sure we'll come to it, DEI1. So these are the district mode specific strategies, which are referenced in a subsequent delivery policy. So I think it's clear that that the sustainable transport strategy is the one that's before you now.
We'll come on to that policy shortly.
Sure,
so
sure.
Okay, that's fine then. As I said, I thought that was the case, but I just wanted clarity on that. Okay. Anything further on CP13 from anybody else? Because I've just got one more element that actually is cross-cutting, which is in relation to parking. Anybody else? No? Okay. You reference in your core policy, and this is why there is an element of not confusion, but an element of inconsistency, because you've got a very specific delivery policy set out in a core policy, because vehicle parking and it's vehicle parking, you're not talking about parking, because you've got cycle parking, you've got other versions of parking. So it does seem very specific for a core policy, but let's just so that's sort of one of my queries. The other query is in relation to the wording that's used. Now, in relation to EI12, which we will be coming on to, in your statement, you're content to modify the wording in the I12 in relation to parking standards, because you refer to having regard to the council's adopted parking standards. In this one, you talk about providing appropriate vehicle parking, and then in, I think it's EI13, where you start to talk about cycle parking, it's I think it's much more specific. Now, I know in your your standards, you talk about adopted standards. Your standards are set out in appendix. So obviously they form part of the plan. So thank you for confirming that. A lot of councils don't do that, and then they can only have regard to it because they don't. The standards don't form part of the plan. So, so do you want what is the council trying to achieve in terms of just general parking standards? Are you requiring? And I recognise that in terms of vehicle parking, you don't specify absolute standards for number of parking spaces, etc. For instance, you do talk about, you know, size of spaces for particular types of parking. Which is absolutely fine. So are you requiring developers to have regard to these standards, or do you require them to accord with them?
Yes, thank you. I thought you might come to this point, and we have been giving it a bit of thought. So our proposal would be in CP13 under Roman numeral 2. It currently says provide appropriate vehicular parking having regard to car ownership and the council's adopted standards. We would be happy to amend that, if obviously subject to your views, on provide appropriate vehicular parking having regard to car ownership and in accordance with the council's adopted standards. That change would, in our opinion, then be consistent with EI12, where it does refer, it says vehicular and cycle parking standards and principles for new development should be provided in accordance with adopted standards as set out in Appendix C of this local plan. So notwithstanding any issue of duplication, which you've already raised, I think in principle, I think that would remove any inconsistency in the sense of having regard in one policy and in accordance within the other. I think that was always our intention. So despite the fact that the vehicular standards are flexible, so we don't have, you know, certain spaces per size of development, the standards are themselves flexible to reflect a number of different criteria. But we do want all development to be in accordance with the standards that are set out in the appendix.
And thank you for that. That's really helpful. In relation to CP13, then, do you just mean vehicular parking, or do you mean all parking? Because you've got specific requirements for cycle parking,
yes.
which I know are under EI13.
Yes.
But obviously you've specifically picked out vehicle parking.
Yes, I think you're right. Appendix C is actually entitled Parking Standards for Vehicles and Cycles. So I think it would be consistent if you are amending the Roman numeral 2 to refer to vehicular and cycle parking standards. Provide appropriate vehicular and cycle parking having regard to car ownership and in accordance with the council's adopted standards.
And my next question, which I'm sure you know is coming, is it required in CP13 when it's in EI12?
I mean, EI12 essentially goes a little bit further because it talks about, well, obviously it refers to Appendix C,
yes,
and then goes on to talk about just requirement for developers to justify their own parking provision, etc., etc. So it does go beyond that. I mean, in theory, if CP13 said provide appropriate vehicular and cycle parking, then that provides a sort of a criteria that it's identified early on in the core policy as a requirement, and other matters can then where you can find them and what other standards, etc., could be. What's the word? The next stage down, delegated, that's the word. Could be delegated to EI12, sorry.
I couldn't remember the word value yesterday,
yes,
so
yes.
Something's in the water.
Yes.
Okay, right, thank you. Also, what do you mean by having regard to car ownership? What's that purpose in that policy?
I think that is that's related. I mean, again, the vehicle parking standards in Appendix C are one of the criteria to refer to a local car ownership levels. The other matters are essentially already covered in other parts of the policy. So the accessibility of the development, the type mix and use of the development, the availability of opportunities for public transport, they're already referred through the high level, the previous high level criteria in CP13. So it is duplicated in the standard. So as I said, if you wanted a purist sort of complete separate the two policies to completely, you would simply have provide appropriate vehicular and cycle parking, and leave it at that.
As I said, it's whether the policy is effective as it currently stands. So it's set out in the standards, so anybody going to the standards would know that they would need to consider that. So as long as there isn't, I don't like duplication, but it's unnecessary duplication. So I'll allow an element of duplicate, or an element of duplication may be acceptable. It's just whether the wording is consistent. The proposed in the standard, it says the proposed provision will need to be demonstrated to be suitable based on the following. And that's where it includes local car ownership levels. And then the policy says have regard to car ownership. So is that the same? Need to be demonstrated to be suitable based on.
You're obviously more experienced than I am in terms of looking at potentially
I'll have a look at that wording. It
but
can trip a lot of people up in dealing with appeals. It's exactly what's required. I mean, to be fair, we're talking about parking standards, so it's less of an issue. It's just ensuring that it's consistent. So there isn't any reference in CP13 to Appendix C, is there?
No.
But then if you start to do that, then you're duplicating EI12.
Yes.
This is so okay. I'll have a look at that. Okay, thank you. Are there any further comments on CP13? Let me just check my notes. I'm sure you'll be glad that we can move on to a different question, a different policy. It is actually coming up to 11 o'clock. So I think what I'd like to do is take a 15-minute break, if that's acceptable to everybody, a comfort break. And we'll come back and hopefully, I will just check my notes, but I think we should hopefully be able to move on to EI12. Okay, so I'll see you back here at 11:15. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. If we can come back. And I'll resume. Okay, I think everybody's back. I think the council would be pleased to hear I haven't got any further questions on CP13, so we can move on, which will be good. So let's move to EI12, which I know we've had a partial discussion on EI12 in relation to when we're discussing CP13. So there is some crossover, but as long as it's not inconsistent, and I suppose it's the use, again, it's the, I know council, you're going to be looking at this, Mr. Russell, about the use of the word must within the policy, because just looking at the parking standards elements that's in EI12, it uses the word should be provided in accordance rather than must be provided in accordance. So, but I know I'm going to leave you to have a look at that. There may be other elements within the policy where you might need to look at just the way that the wording is put, but I'll leave you to have a look at that. And then if you wish to, if you're content and think that the way that the use of the word should is more appropriate, then if you can let us know. And then that may be something that we discuss when we come to consider and going through any main modifications later on, potentially. Other than that, I'm not sure if anybody else has got any other queries on EI12. Mr. Russell.
Just to make the point that at a previous session on 11B, when we talked about strategic transport infrastructure, we had a piece of homework to look at amendments to policies to reflect the concerns of national highways. So we have circulated some draft changes to
right, so that's within it. Yes,
yeah.
I have got them, haven't opened them. So
right, yeah. It's just if you would like me
to be useful
walk you through those
okay.
changes, just so that you're aware of them, then
just bear with me then while I get them up.
Happy to do so.
Okay. We'll just make sure I'm opening the right document. Okay, I've got the list of suggested modifications. Is that the document that you're referring to?
It's potential modifications in response to National Highways Reg 19 comments. That's the sort of the headline. It may be that you're looking at the more general list of modifications. It may simply be that
what's it titled? What is it, a separate document?
Yes, it is. It may not be that we've submitted it yet. I know we'd sent it to National Highways for their comments, but
no.
I mean, Lisa's got a hand up. I don't know if she wants to clarify that.
No, position. I haven't got that.
Okay, so is that something you would like us to submit first for your consideration rather than raise it today in the context of EI12?
I suppose I haven't had a chat. I would need to have a look at those comments.
They're relatively minor points, but
well, can you tell me what those changes are?
Yes,
and then when the document is sent through to me, if I need to then either reopen something or discuss at a later session, then we can do. So if you can just set it out and go through what the potential changes or suggested changes are.
Yes, I'll set them out in the context of the issues that were raised. So I think the first change is relatively minor. It is in the paragraph, the first paragraph under enhancing accessibility.
Yes.
It says major development proposals, or those that are likely to have a significant impact on the local transport network. So we are proposing to insert the word strategic, and so it would read,
right,
likely to have a significant impact on the strategic and local transport network will be required, etc., etc. So that's the first change. The second change is in relation to the reference is proposals which are likely to prejudice the future development of strategic transport infrastructure. I'm just trying to find where that is in the policy.
Is that still
That's
in the...
sorry, that's the final paragraph just before enhancing accessibility. In fact, it's the last sentence.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, got it.
Proposals which are likely to prejudice the future. We would like to insert the words compromise the safe and efficient operation of, or prejudice. So it would read proposals which are likely to compromise the safe and efficient operation of, comma, or, and then prejudice the future development of strategic transport infrastructure will not be permitted. That was in response about national highways, that one of the issues is around the safe and efficient operation of the strategic road network.
Okay.
And then the next change is it's the supporting paragraph 5.56, where it, let me just check. Sorry, I'm struggling on this bit to find. It's not actually. It's again, it's an insertion of strategic or. So in other words, we make reference to a local transport network. So we're simply adding the word strategic or to local transport network. I'm trying to find where that is.
Well, the first sentence refers to local transport network on 5.56.
Yes, sorry, yes, there we go. So it's adding strategic
so it's on the strategic
or local transport network, and then going further down, as regards the latter, the council recommends early discussion with the relevant highway authority officers to identify the scope of supporting information required, to identify the scope of supporting information required and the potential impacts and necessary measures. So it's just a minor word change there. And probably the most important change, given the discussions that we had on the strategic network, going back to the policy, again, just the paragraph before the section entitled Enhancing Accessibility, where we talk about contributions where reasonable and viable will be sought towards these strategic transport infrastructure schemes, including M5 junction 12, 13 and 14 improvements from strategic allocations through the plan period. So we're adding the specific references to the M5 junction 12, 13 and 14.
Okay, say that one again. So it's including M5 junction.
Including M5 junction 12, 13 and 14 improvements, and then going back to the words from strategic allocations.
Okay.
Throughout
so it's
the plan
making
period.
it specific.
Yes.
Okay.
As I say, I don't believe Lisa's team have come back on that point, but I may be wrong. We've got quite a few emails in my inbox that I haven't responded to yet, but hopefully collectively we find those changes acceptable. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Ms. McCaffrey, please.
Yeah, thank you. Just on that point, we haven't yet reviewed them. A bit like Mark, there's a lot of emails for various different schemes. So we will review those comments and come back to the council.
Okay, that'd be really helpful. Thank you. Once it's been confirmed that that National Highways is, and if you can include then make sure that Gloucestershire County Council as the Highway Authority is also content with the wording, if you can then send that through to us and just confirm this is a joint response and we're content with the wording now, then that would be very helpful. Thank you.
We will
and
do
then,
so.
And then myself and my colleague can consider it. Thank you. Thank you. Are there any other queries or questions on EI12? Mr. Alexander.
Yeah, it's just a sort of bit of clarification in terms of the cycle parking standards that's in Appendix C. Currently, Table A reads minimum cycle and motorcycle parking standards. So it's a bit ambiguous in terms of the motorcycle parking. Does that need to be in there? Should that be separated out? To me, it should be minimum cycle parking standards, excluding motorcycle.
Council response?
I don't have an immediate response to that point. I would probably need to refer back to colleagues on that point.
Sorry, go on.
I was just kind of going back really to clarify what the concern is. Is the concern that that we shouldn't have parking standards for motorcycles, or that they should be different, or because at the moment clearly it refers to both in this using the same standards. So what exactly is the sort of clarity issue, or if it's a clarity issue, or is it
the concern would be if you took it as it is, you'd have the same number of cycle parking as motorcycle parking if you applied the standards to both. So I would imagine that the motorcycle may be sort of separated out as a separate standard or some wording associated with that, but clearly minimum cycle parking standards are important, and the parking standards provision for those sort of make sense, but it's just having the motorcycle in there, I think, confuses matters.
Is sorry, I'm just looking at what the actual standards say. Is motorcycle actually referenced in the standards, or is it only in the title of Table A?
It's only in the title of Table A.
So it's not elsewhere within that standard.
It's not in obviously page 323. There's cycle parking, and then I'm just scanning it. There is no reference to motorcycle parking there. I would need to check whether that's simply a mistake, or what exactly the.
And that also does raise the issue of there are other forms of wheeled transport now.
There, absolutely.
Scooters, for instance. So and I know the issues around, you know, sort of the use of illegal scooters and that, but there are an awful lot of you know, schemes where scooters are available, but parking, it can be an issue of those scooters, and they're just left here, there, and everywhere. When you're talking about city schemes, for instance, which I'm referring to, when you're obviously when dealing with new settlements, that may be something that forms part of this you know, whether a scheme is created on those or not. So
if you're happy,
could the council
I'll
just have a yes?
Yeah.
I know you're not going to be able to give an answer here, but it's something that's just popped into my head for consideration, thinking about that. So thank you for raising the issue on the motorcycle. I have to admit I hadn't noticed that myself, possibly because the table A, I just read it as cycle, not motorcycle. So thank you for that. I'll leave that with the council then, if you want to have a look at that. Obviously, if I don't know if the council or the county council has any other sort of standards, or whether it's necessary, or whether it needs to be just on a site-by-site basis consideration of parking, but then it's where these are going to, isn't it? It's not just about the site, is it? It's about where this is beyond just the site.
Yes,
because it's
absolutely.
about where people are going to use these wheeled facilities and actually going to need to go to, and where they need to park. So that's a slightly separate matter. But in relation to cycle parking where people live and work or go to the shops, etc., then that is something that needs to be considered. Okay, I'll leave that with you then. That's an action for the council. Okay, anything further on EI12? Or the appendix C? No. Okay. If we then move on to DEI1. Now, this reads as a council objective. So as it's written, it's not a policy, as in a policy requirement. It may be a policy for the council to follow, but it's not, as it's written, a policy that requires anything in relation to a decision maker needs to take it into account, or a developer or a resident needs to ensure that development has taken it into account. So can I just confirm what the purpose of the policy is, what the council's trying to achieve, and whether changing the wording will make it much more specific as to what the requirement is from developers? Because you talk about these district-wide mode-specific strategies. So the policy seems to talk about we will work with partners to produce these, but what is it that you want developers to do with them? I suppose that's what I'm getting at. Or is that set out within policies, within other policies?
Yes. So just to say why have we included this within the plan, and where it's come from. So it was a specific recommendation which is set out in the Sustainable Transport Strategy. So it's page 17 of the original sustainable Sustainable Transport Strategy. So in essence, in order to achieve the objectives set out in the Sustainable Transport Strategy, the recommendation is that the district council, working with the relevant highway authorities, develops these I guess you would call them sub-strategies or sub-sector strategies for various elements of active travel and public transport to embed the principles in the policy in terms of actual delivery. So I do accept that as it's written at the moment, it's essentially an action on the district council working with Gloucestershire County Council and National Highways. The overall objective is, as it says, to enhance sustainable travel opportunities for all. Now, what the intention would be is that, having produced these documents, when developers are looking at considering all possible sustainable transport options in the context of core policy CP13 to minimise travel, achieve alternatives to the car, that they will have regard to, or that they will, yes, that they should have regard to those strategies. Now, I appreciate that they haven't been produced, so there's always this tension. We can't examine these strategies to determine the extent to which development proposals should be in accordance with them, or must. So I do accept that if we were to include some additional wording around development proposals when considering all possible sustainable transport options should have regard to these strategies, that could be, that could be a form of wording which should then link the production of those strategies to developments when they're considering how they implement necessary transport measures. So they just so that for the sake of everybody in the room, they talk about a walking and cycling strategy, shared mobility strategy, interchange strategy, district-wide parking strategy, and a public transport corridor strategy. Now, they don't necessarily have to be, and I wouldn't intend them to be long, complex documents. They can be quite short, setting out the approach that would deliver the sustainable transport strategy of the local plan. Various elements of them may already be contained within the local transport plan, and we know, and obviously colleagues from the county can confirm, that there are already local cycling, walking investment plans in production or have been produced for areas of the district. And there's already, as part of the local transport planner, sort of area strategies. So I'm not suggesting we reinvent the wheel. It may be a case of reflecting what's in the local transport plan and then providing a bit more local detail and local context in terms of Stroud district. But that's essentially the purpose of those strategies. They're produced by the council working with the county council and National Highways, and they will unpick the sustainable transport strategy for the particular modes that we've been talking about. And it's not in the plan at the moment, but it would be helpful to signpost developments to those strategies in terms of having regard to the site-specific approach that those developers may take. So, for example, one of the issues I know was people have raised is around, what are the choices in more rural areas, and it may be that in the context of this policy that we identify that that as Mr. Carter said earlier, that we focus very much on public transport corridors. I mean, if there are sites which are, you know, in proximity to that to the particular public transport corridors identified within Stroud district, then, you know, we would look at sustainable transport choices in the context of linking into that movement corridor. Or if you have a site which is close, I know we're going to talk about the walking and cycling policy in a minute, but that if you have a site which is close to one of those strategic walking and cycling corridor routes that's identified in the LTP and the walking and cycling investment plans, then again, the emphasis on proposals close to those corridors would be to prioritize active travel and connect into those strategic corridors. If you're in a rural area which is not associated with any of those, then that is a real opportunity to do that through these documents.
And will there be any obviously I recognise they're not in existence yet, but I'm just looking at the wording that's used within what you set out in the plan. And for instance, under 5.65, the public transport corridor strategy, you've got a sentence there that says pump prime funding for these measures, so the measures that will be highlighted through the strategy, will be sought from developer contributions. So obviously we're having a developer contributions discussion tomorrow. And notwithstanding the other policies that set out the site allocation policies and the other transport related policies, would these strategies, or is it anticipated these strategies would highlight anything further than what is already set out in the STS? As you said, it was a recommendation from the STS, so it's underpinning the objectives of that. So I'm trying to understand why these are necessary now, or are these going to underpin the next plan, the review in 5 years' time, for instance, subject to what's happening with LURB, etc.
I think the intention, subject to, as you say, any changes to the system, well, there would be transitional arrangements, so I think we're hopefully safe for at least 5 years in terms of this plan. The intention is that these strategies unpack the existing sustainable transport strategy, so they wouldn't go beyond what's already. And I'm very conscious about, you know, trying to introduce policies through supplementary planning documents. That's clearly a no-no. So there's no intention to do that. It's simply explaining what's in the sustainable transport strategy for the Stroud district in terms of those particular modes, providing it would be a sort of a clarifying spatially what that would actually look like in terms of in terms of Stroud district. It would provide guidance for planning applicants in terms of how they could support the strategy, and it would reference, no doubt, specific sections in the local transport plan or these local cycling and walking investment plans that the county is rolling out. So it would not be a case of introducing new policy requirements.
And as you said it would be have regard to, rather than
absolutely.
And then it can be dealt with on a site-by-site basis, dealing with that. Any comments on that? I know I've got Ms. McCaffrey, your hands up.
Thank you. It's a very minor comment from me. In August 21, National Highways had a name change from Highways England, so it would be useful when if the plan's adopted and there's modifications, that the name is modified within that. Thank you.
That can be done as an additional modification. Any factual name changes can be done by the council. It doesn't need main modification for that. So I'll leave that for the council to do. But I totally agree. All names should be updated. So thank you. Okay, let me just finish my note. Does anybody else have any comments on the discussions on DEI 1? If I can leave that with the council to reconsider the wording of that, to make sure that it's clearly a policy that sets out clear policy requirements. Okay. Right, no further questions? Right, let's move on to the next policy then, which is the protecting and extending walking and cycling routes. Now, in the council statement, you've confirmed, you've answered our queries in relation to what is meant by significant harm. You've clarified that the routes are on the policies map. So thank you for that. And I'm not going to go over the discussion that we had previously about consistency with wording with CPE 13 and EI 12 in relation to should the word be in accordance with or not, because council's confirmed what the wording should be on that. A concern has been raised about what the policy is saying, or what would be expected in relation to major development schemes. The second sentence says major development should provide new walking and cycling routes within the development and connect to nearby established and proposed walking and cycling routes. And a concern that's been raised is about this requirement to connect to nearby established and proposed walking and cycling routes, and whether that implies there's no restrictions on distance, whether there would be it would be anticipated that that there would be, the onus would be on the developer to try and deliver quite extensive connections, which may not be either physically possible or limited, or it may not be viable with the scheme, with the development scheme. And it's also been suggested that the policy should allow for alternatives where necessary, rather than the provisions as set out. I think, I'm not sure if you're in the meeting. I think this was, just bear with me. Yes, this was Cress Nicholson, so it's Mr. Clement's comments, which were in his statement in relation to this policy. So unfortunately, he's not in the meeting.
No, I think he's back now.
I am back.
Aha, you are back. Sorry, I didn't notice you there. Sorry.
I'm sitting next to you on my screen. I don't know about yours.
Excellent. No, it moves all around. It's
yeah,
depending on where you are. No, I've got you there. Thank you. I didn't want to put words in your mouth. I wasn't sure if you were still here, which is why I wanted to try and summarize your points. Do you want to just explain what your concerns are with the policy, or have I summarized it appropriately?
I think you have, ma'am. I've got them in front of me, and it was myself and Stuart tag teaming making the points. But yeah, I think it is a point of necessity being reasonable and proportionate to development, and making the need for such connections clear as to what is achievable, rather than an open-ended aspiration as the policy states originally. So I don't know what the council's thinking is on that. I think, as we've said, we support the aspiration overall. It just needs to make sure that the detail of the implementation doesn't create viability issues or implementation issues.
Council response?
I mean, I could say, well, it'll be a case-by-case basis, which I guess applies to all of the policies. You have to exercise judgment when you're considering how those policies apply to specific parcels of land. But to be slightly more helpful, I mean, it does refer to nearby established and proposed walking and cycling routes. So there is certainly no intention of contributing either financial contributions or actual physical works on routes which are not nearby or indeed adjacent. There may be an issue there in the sense that we reference in the first paragraph nearby established and proposed walking and cycling routes, and then we do in the next paragraph we refer to development adjacent to walking and cycling routes. So but in both those words, you know, normal Oxford English Dictionary definitions would apply. We're not looking at contributions to areas not spatially related to the sites, and hopefully there's no disagreement in principle that new development should connect up with existing networks. I mean, that's what we're all here for, I guess. Ultimately, is to ensure that we deliver the objectives of the MPPF and other supporting documents around achieving good walking and cycling networks. So yes, if there is any minor clarification of wording, then which would help the reader, then we're happy to agree to that wording.
And the policy does say should rather than must. So does that give an element of flexibility?
Well, I am mindful of your previous homework, which in relation to all transport policies was to look at the relationship between must and should. So I'm
absolutely, and you're going to look at the national policy on that, aren't
you?
But
I would welcome the views, particularly I think Nathan's got his hand up. It would be helpful in the context that we are partners in delivering walking and cycling. So it would be really, really good to get his feedback on that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Drover, please.
Thank you, ma'am. Yeah, so we've done some carbon modelling of growth options and carbon reduction pathways, and we're looking at a 300% increase in active travel to hit our carbon reduction target. So I think Mr. Fong's on the call. He uses the word paradigm shift. So it's not going to be business as usual, and we're wrestling with this in the development management world, where developers must, not should, provide the internalisation network on major developments. There's no doubt about it. When you get to the third-party land issues, should the county council or the planning authority act as some sort of facilitator to deliver those links? And I think that's probably is yes, they should, because it would then involve compulsory purchase and those things that the developer just can't do. So if we want to continue bringing forward developments, then I think the local authorities have to have a facilitating role in overcoming those third-party land issues, and we do. So what we might have is we must have the internal network, and then the external links to nearby facilities, where they can provide them in the highway margin or by negotiation with landowners, fine. Where they can't, then it is a contribution approach. I think that would be my preference. But not very easy to write into a policy.
No. Mr. Russell, your thoughts from a council perspective?
Well, I suppose there's two aspects to Nathan's point. One is the sort of flexibility for external links where they're possible. So, you know, it could be differentiating between must for the within the development and, you know, where possible, connect to nearby established and proposed walking and cycling routes. But I can't really comment on the contributions aspect. That takes it beyond the nature of or the purpose of this particular policy. I mean, we have obviously, as we'll come on to, a policy around infrastructure and contributions, which I think is more appropriate place to consider that issue. But so I'd be reluctant to get into the issue of contributions in terms of this policy, but differentiating between what's in the complete control of the developer and what may be possible to provide some flexibility or external, that I think is an appropriate place, appropriate way forward on that.
Mr. Clements, any comments you want to make on what you've heard?
Thank you, Mum. Just picking up at those 2 points, yes, it is a vexed issue, probably drafting the policy, but given that it is referring to off-site contributions potentially, it's whether there is a qualification in the policy that includes necessary and proportionate, so that there is a cross-reference to what is appropriate from a 106 or a planning obligations point of view, and then to cross-reference it to the appropriate policy there to make the development acceptable, and by inference to be in accordance with the wider strategic transport objectives that we've discussed earlier. So I think just a point of clarification perhaps in the policy. Thank you.
Mr. Russell, can I ask that the council has a look at that, please?
Yes, of course.
And as you said, if necessary, you can discuss with Mr. Clements, discuss with Mr. Drover, to try and come up with something that doesn't go beyond. Obviously, we've got the developer contributions discussion tomorrow. But I'm not saying you need to provide this by tomorrow. That's far too short notice. But if you can have a look at that, I'll give a deadline probably by the end of the. I'll consider what deadline I would like this information in by at the end of the week, and I'll give that to you then.
Thank you.
Hopefully. Thank you. Anything else on EI 13? No. Can we move on to EI 14 then, please? This is the provision and protection of rail stations and halts. So I do have a number of questions on this. Now, I recognise that the new proposed railway station at Bristol Road Stonehouse is still on the cards. So the policy is proposing to protect the land that's identified for that provision. The rest of the policy, I'm trying to understand how it fits with the site allocation policies. So you've got the reopening of so you mentioned the Sharpness, the reopening of the branch line to passenger services for Sharpness, but that's already set out under the Sharpness policy, PS 36. So why does it need to be in that policy when it's part of the site allocation? And then the policy in relation to Hunts Grove, reference is made to Hunts Grove. Now I've got some conflicting evidence here, so I'm trying to understand what this means. And fortunately, Mr. Clements is in the room, who may be able to confirm, because I'm going to be referring to his submission. How does a policy relate to PS 30, which is in obviously the allocation for Hunts Grove extension? I know Hunts Grove is already a committed site, but you've got the extension in the plan. So is there a duplication of requirements that sets out in PS 30? And then Mr. Clements in the statement on behalf of Crest Nicholson has stated that the planning permission for Hunts Grove required safeguarding of land for the station for a period of 5 years, but that lapsed in 2015. So I'm trying to understand, what does that mean? So is the station proposed to be in the Hunts Grove site or in the extension? Because it's referenced in PS 30 as a requirement. So I'm just trying to understand the implications of this policy and whether it's consistent, or even whether it's that the reference to these other stations, are they required when they're already set out elsewhere in the plan? So Mr. Clements, is that correct, what I've said? Anything you want to amend or alter?
Ma'am, perhaps if I can give a bit of background.
If you could, that'd be very helpful.
The last point first.
Thank you.
Because similar to Mr. Fong, my vintage goes back to the 2005 local plan with Hunts Grove. That site did indeed protect land for a rail station, potential future rail station.
And here we're talking about the Hunts Grove site,
the main site,
not PS 30, not the extension.
That's correct, ma'am. So that is the land that we refer to as north of Haresfield Lane.
Right. Okay.
So the main site, as we refer to it. There is land there, or there was land originally to be reserved for a rail halt or a rail station adjacent to the rail line, obviously. That is beyond the current allocation PS 30. The planning permission, without going into significant detail, was rolled forward via various Section 73 permissions, and indeed our reps, there is a slight inconsistency, or it's slightly incorrect, in that the land was actually safeguarded in accordance with that policy and then the planning permission for Hunts Grove until 2017. So there was a period from implementation when the land had to be safeguarded. The land wasn't taken up. There were discussions with Network Rail at the time of first implementation and subsequently, and there was never a plan for the station to be implemented. So that requirement, as a consequence of the permission, which, as you've suggested, is being implemented and built out, has lapsed. So the point we've made through representations to this plan is that the provision relating to Hunts Grove itself, because I think there's also a policy criterion within that policy that talks about safeguarding of land, falls outside of the PS 30 land area, and the actual obligation via the permission and the implemented development has actually lapsed. So just to fully finish the point, in terms of the land itself, the objectives of this policy wouldn't be compromised because the land itself falls outside of the developed area of the site. So the land is vacant and is used as supporting green infrastructure at the moment. So physically a station could be provided there, but the obligation on the developer via the permission no longer pertains.
So the land is not included within the PS30.
That's correct. Yeah.
Boundary. Okay. Now, I don't particularly want to get into too much discussions on PS30, but I do want this clarification on the boundary of that. Now, the allocation is an extension, but what the policy says is that the full extent of the Huntsgrove new community is outlined on the policies map. Not quite sure why, because the policies map should be showing development, the geographical distribution of the development proposals, not necessarily commitments. They can show commitments, but I presume it's then the policies map is showing it as a commitment. Sorry, I've not got the policies map up in front of me. I don't want to spend time going and finding it at the moment. So does it just show it as a commitment? There's
yes, that's
site?
correct.
Okay,
yes,
that's fine. It can show these sites. So that's what it means in the policy. Okay.
The reason we've included it is to provide some context to the PS30, whilst the base map has yet to be fully reflecting the development as it takes place, because the Huntsgrove extension of PS30 is an integral part of that wider Huntsgrove development. But yes,
which we'll come to and we'll
yes,
discuss when we are under matter 6, obviously. But it's very useful highlighting it now. Because that's something that would need to be considered, that land would need to be included within the policy, the allocation, if it was a requirement of the policy. Now, we're not going to get into the ins and outs of whether it is a requirement or not now. We'll discuss that when we come to PS30 discussions. But it doesn't take away the fact of whether it needs to be in policy EI14 anyway, because what is EI14 trying to do?
So EI14 is bringing together the various bits of the plan which relate to provision and protection of railway stations and put them all in one place. So if a reader developer were looking at rail provision and what policies might apply to the rail network and a rail infrastructure, then they would go to this rather than having to read all of the strategic allocation policies to pick out where there may be some reference to rail. So in that sense, it's providing clarity to the reader of the policies relating to rail infrastructure in the district. Now, within the policy, there are levels of different levels of commitment, should we say. So we know that Land of Bristol Road, as it says, is identified on the policies map for the delivery of a station. We know that there's a strategic outline business case which is for the Department for Transport. So that's incidentally, whilst we're talking about that, the landowner is fully supportive of the site being safeguarded and being identified on the policy map.
So in terms of setting that out as this is land that's required for the provision of this future station, that is not an issue in terms of the policy at all. I suppose what the issue is why is there a requirement to protect other existing stations? Or other stations. So there's existing stations which are already in existence, and then other stations that may come on board or may not, that are set out in other site allocations. So you're saying, well, it's to help readers, but I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah. So in a previous session, we looked at the canal policy, which did a number of things. It essentially protected the existing corridor, the existing canal network. It identified the proposal to restore parts of the canal network, and it also talked about development in the vicinity that might impact upon the canal network. In a similar way, that's what this policy does for rail. It safeguards land for a specific proposal. It gives general support to reopening the branch line at Sharpness. So it just clarifies that, yes, it's within the proposed allocation, but notwithstanding that, it supports it as the delivery of the rail infrastructure and reopening of the branch line, essentially irrespective of whether it's part of the development proposal. But obviously we support its delivery through the development proposal in the plan. The other issue is around this is a wider issue around, we've already started talking about how things are moving fast in terms of future public transport provision. We know that there is a movement away from sort of intercity focus to more of a regional focus on lines and the opportunity to reopen or open new railway stations along the main lines. So we've had Charfield in South Gloucestershire, which has got permission and is, pretty certain that will be a reopened station. We've got our proposal at Stonehouse for reopening Stonehouse Station, and we have the County Council, for example, did a study fairly recently on the rail investment strategy, looking at options for railway stations between Stroud, Stonehouse and Gloucester. And so there is quite a lot of activity at the moment around exploring the potential for new stations. So this is just the sort of second paragraph is essentially a supporting statement towards opening or reopening passenger stations and halts, subject to obviously being coming through relevant feasibility studies. The final section is around development which might result in the loss of land or facilities. So we refer to Stonehouse, which is obviously the reference to the support and which is identified in the first paragraph. We do refer to Hunts Grove, and that is in the context in the paragraph 5.72 of the County Council examining options for a new station south of Gloucester. Now, we do recognise that that's at a very early stage. We also recognise that Hunts Grove isn't necessarily going to be the preferred location. There may be other locations. Certainly, there was a bid to the reopening railway fund by the County Council looking at a site further south of Gloucester itself within Stroud district, but that was one of a number of options. So the reference to Hunts Grove at the end is in the context of that wider examining future options. Now, excuse me, I do take the point from Mr. Clements that the permission of the safeguarding in the context of the permission has lapsed, and I do accept that we don't have firm proposals for a new station at Hunts Grove, and it may be that this actually safeguarding the land at Hunts Grove is not something that is deliverable, but it is something that we've got a site. Mr. Clements said it's not subject to any development proposal. In fact, it's part of the green infrastructure. I'm not putting words in his mouth, but let's say for the sake of argument that Network Rail did consider that was a good location. I don't think that prejudices Hunts Grove itself. In fact, it would probably provide, well, it would provide significant attraction to that area and would improve permeability and accessibility significantly in the Gloucester Fringe area. But it's not a firm proposal in the plan. So yeah, so that's all I can say really. I don't know if the council would like to provide any sort of commentary on. I've sort of said broadly what the rail infrastructure strategy is doing.
That's been really helpful.
Yeah.
I will bring in Mr. Clements
Yeah.
and Mr. Long in a minute.
Yeah.
So what the policy is trying to achieve in relation to Hunts Grove, just so I'm clear, is that it is saying that development that would result in the loss of land for the provision of a station at Hunts Grove would not be permitted, irrespective of the planning permission, etc. And that's actually not to do with PS30 because the land is outside of PS30.
Yes, that's correct.
So it's a separate policy in that context.
Yes.
We'll, as part of PS30, we'll have more discussions on this. So we may have to return to this policy in relation to Hunts Grove in particular later on, once I've got more details on going through the Hunts Grove matters. Because the issue will then be, well, why is it in PS30 then? Because a specific reference in PS30, whether the council is saying, well, a contribution or whatever it needs to be made to any potential future, that's different wording. So just to give you a heads up, that will be discussed as part of PS30. We're not going to be discussing that
Absolutely.
now.
Yeah, I fully understand that point.
Okay.
There needs to be consistency between the policies.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Clements, and then I'll come to Mr. Long.
Thank you, Ma'am. Yes, just carry on the point you've really made. It is we are of the view, Crest are of the view that neither Hunts Grove nor the Hunts Grove extension were contingent upon the provision of the station. So therefore, being an integral part of the policy is an issue for us. However, as I mentioned earlier, the land is there. It would be available for provision of a station were feasibility studies, demand studies to reveal a need for the provision of one. There is only a very limited part of the site on which the station could be accommodated because the rail line only runs adjacent to the very eastern edge of the site beyond PS30. So I don't think Crest Nicholson would have an issue with land being safeguarded for that purpose if it was to meet a wider strategic travel need or aspiration. I think where we have something of an issue is that it becomes an integral part of Hunts Grove, which is already well underway, and the transport evidence has indicated that there was no need for provision of a station to justify that, and similarly for the extension. So the actual safeguarding of the land as a separate policy requirement, not a problem, but as an integral part of the Hunts Grove wider proposals, that's where we perhaps have a bit more of a concern.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Mr. Long, please.
Thank you, Inspector. I think we're probably all on the same page that the safeguarding policies are a good one to have. It's just a point of clarification for me, and it might assist you to understand why some of this is in. Shortly after our last session, Western Gateway published a 2050 vision for the local rail network. I don't know if that's in the evidence yet. Question for Mr. Russell and Mr. Drover, whether they want it in, because it probably assists their policy, adds a bit of weight to it. We'll see what's going to come forward longer term in the plan period.
I'm trying to think back now when we had the first, when we were looking at strategic sort of rail, we didn't get down to the nitty-gritty smaller elements. Reference was made to some strategic document, but I'm not sure if it was that one.
I think
in relation to rail.
I think the publication was the day after the last session. So I think we just missed it.
Okay, so probably just missed it then.
I don't know whether you want to put it
I will ask Mr. Russell to have a look at that and see whether it's it's something that he would like submitted, because it helps.
I think Gloucestershire are a party to it, so if that assists.
Okay.
Thank you.
What's it called? What's the actual document called?
The Western Gateway 2050 vision to transport rail for South Wales and Western England. So it covers the wider region up into Gloucestershire, down into Bristol, across to South Wales, etc.
Okay, that's just for my notes. I'm not going to be looking it up or anything because we don't find our own evidence.
That's fine.
As you're aware. So, Mr. Russell, if I can leave you to have a look at that, and if you feel that it would be helpful, then by all means, I would be content for you to submit that to us for us to have a look at. If you don't think actually it adds anything further, then again, if you can just let us know, then we don't need to consider that any further. But thank you for that suggestion. That's really helpful.
Yeah, we will do that. Thank you. And thank you, Chris, for pointing that out. Thank you.
Okay. Is there anything further on EI 14? No. Okay. Let's move on then to EI 15. So again, and I think I know what Mr. Russell's answer is going to be on this one, considering the take on canals and railways. It's a protection policy. And I think Mr. Russell knows what I'm going to say, or what my query is going to be, which is in relation to how does this policy relate to PS 34? And why does there need to be a separate policy? What's it trying to achieve?
Yes. So there are two separate projects essentially. There is the specific Canal and Rivers Trust project around the regeneration of the docks, which we obviously have a specific policy on. But we also have an operational docks there with a dock company, and we have various other, particularly in the southern part of the docks, we have a number of commercial organisations that are related that transfer materials to and from the docks. Now, at the moment, the transfer of those materials is by road, but there is a railhead at Sharpness Docks which is not being used. So if the Canal and Rivers Trust proposal comes forward, then obviously the policy requirements set out in the plan or the strategic allocation will kick in and will apply. But regardless of that, there are operational docks there, and so this is around achieving modal shift essentially to rail, which is again consistent with our overall approach towards sustainable transport in the district. So this is although it's clearly interrelated, it's the same physical area, and the Canal and Rivers Trust proposals will support the wider utilisation of the railway network, and indeed Sharpness New Settlement will, in terms of introducing passenger facilities. But this is a specific policy which can apply irrespective of whether those developments take place, and that's more relating to mode shift for operations at the docks themselves.
Is it deliverable? Is there demand for freight facility for businesses providing freight facilities?
I'd have to defer to my colleague here. I think, Conrad, would you like to come in?
Yes, I put my hand up, but when this policy first appeared in the last local plan, there were certainly ongoing discussions with companies such as Howard Tennant's down there about reinvigorating the freight facilities as part of their business model down at the docks. And subsequent to the last local plan, such discussions have continued on an ad hoc basis, but clearly there is interest in that possibility of shifting from road transport for their products to the potential of rail. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. You said, Mr. Russell, that should the regeneration happen as envisaged by the Canal and River Trust, which is what PS34 is, should that happen? So I know we'll be coming on to discuss PS34 again later on under matter 6. Does that mean there are concerns that it won't be delivered, and that's why it's essential that there's a separate policy on freight, or that irrespective of whether PS34 actually happens or not, because an allocation doesn't mean that it will get permission or will actually happen, hopefully, but you know, isn't always the case, depends what comes up. Are you saying that it's necessary anyway, whether PS34 happens or doesn't? And it is other freight facilities within the PS34 site boundary or are they outside? So it would need to be separate anyway.
The railhead is well, it's essentially right on the edge of PS34. It depends, again, I'm not a railway expert in terms of signalling and the exact how the railhead operates in relation to the boundary on okay. PS34. I
have been down there, so I'm trying to visualize it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's entirely straightforward, but it's not that we don't think that the Canal and Rivers Trust proposals will come forward, but their proposals are primarily around a leisure and tourism generated.
So it's a completely, this is about business.
Well, it's complicated because the Canal and Rivers Trust own the land, but the docks themselves is a separate commercial organisation that have a have a license and have a lease. So there's a slightly different flavour to these policies. They do overlap spatially, but one is around achieving modal shift for the freight operators and the businesses at Sharpness Docks, and the other policy is around creating a leisure and tourism generated.
Okay, I understand the difference. Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you for that. Any other queries on EI15? No, got no other hands up. Can we move on then to the final policy that we're considering under this session, which is EI16. Now, this is provision of public transport facilities. Specific reference to bus and taxi operators. So if I can just start with the council, just to explain the reasoning for this being a separate policy and why focusing on bus and taxi operators. First time that taxi operators have been highlighted within the plan.
So this is a proposal, a policy specifically around supporting bus and taxi public transport facilities in the context of operations and supporting layouts which would facilitate those operators to maximize their operations, modal shift, etc., and also relating to physical infrastructure, shelters, seating, etc. We do acknowledge that we, as we've gone through the other policies, that there are other policies which talk specifically around developers contributing to public transport and walking, active travel, and then public transport provision. So there isn't a specific reference to the needs of bus and taxi operators, but I do recognise that there is a degree of overlap between the policies that we've talked about to date and this policy. Yeah, that's probably all I need to say at this stage.
Councillor Jones.
Thank you, ma'am. Sorry for the delay. I was just checking on Google Earth, coming back to your question a moment ago about the railhead and PS34. Just for information, it is included within the red line of PS34, the railhead at Sharpness Docks.
It is, okay. I thought so, because I was trying to remember when I went down there. But thank you for that clarification. Thank you. I suppose it's what is it adding and is it consistent? I suppose it's not necessarily inconsistent. It just gives a little bit more detail on layouts. But that would be a requirement anyway. Because you're saying it should encourage operational efficiency. Well, it goes beyond encouragement, isn't it, really? Are there, so there is there a taxi strategy in the council, or is there
Not at present. Obviously, we've already talked about the public transport corridor strategy and other strategies in the context of the DEI 1. But no, there's no specific taxi strategy. We would see obviously taxi is a form of public transport.
It is. It has its role, absolutely, in the transport hierarchy. Okay, I'm just looking at its effectiveness of what it's actually trying to encourage. So it's talking about encourage development proposals should cater where appropriate, and then encourage operational efficiency and maximize bus passenger traffic, etc., which is already set out anyway elsewhere. So I'm just trying to understand the effectiveness of the policy. But if there isn't, there is an element of duplication again. I'll have a look at it and see. Whether it has issues in terms of effectiveness. But I've heard the council's point on that. Mr. Moore.
Yes, it was the background to policy which appeared in the last local plan as well. But at that time, there was redevelopment around Stroud Town Centre. There was redevelopment around potential at Dursley, where there are bus station and taxi areas. So it was seen as being a necessary element within the local plan requiring a policy.
I'll have a look at it. See, there's no harm in having a policy in as long as it meets the tests and it's sound. It's just whether it's effective, the way that it's written. But I'll have a look at that anyway. Okay, thank you. Are there any other comments on EI 16? No. Are there any other comments in relation to transport issues? I know we will come back to, I'm sure transport will be considered when we deal with individual site allocations. That will be expected as part of those considerations. Let me just see. Sorry, I've not got your name down. So, sorry, who are you on behalf of? I'm trying to read it. I've got a sent. I don't know how to say the name. Sent Haywood. I don't know how to say it.
Louisa Sent Haywood. I'm the Strategic Transport Planning Manager at Gloucestershire.
Right. Okay. Sorry.
Hi.
Yes,
no
you are on my list.
I just wanted to give an update. There was a question earlier about Metro West. So I've asked our rail lead, and he said it's going to start operating in May 23, so this month. So it sounds imminent, and it will result in an increase in the service frequency in the morning peak.
Okay. Thank you for that. That's really helpful. Okay, thank you. Mr. Butcher, please.
Oh, thank you, Ma'am. Sorry, I'm not sure if this is appropriate in terms of, I think you said earlier that there might be an opportunity to go back to local transport discussions.
Well, I just said if anybody, because obviously I opened up with let's talk about local transport infrastructure,
yeah.
And then I said if anybody thought of anything while we were going through the session, then I'm more than welcome to I'm more than happy to listen to you. Okay, so I have 2 points, but this one relates to sort of public transport. That the comment that it's an observation about sort of increasing the services with Stagecoach. I mean, as a user of Stagecoach, I have seen over the years, and we know it's a fact, there's been a consolidation of routes and obviously a reduction in service. This happened before the lockdown, but also has been triggered by lockdown. And I just wonder the scale of, I mean, the cost and subsidy and ongoing costs that will be needed to support an expansion of public transport would seem to me to be huge. So what's your question? What's your query then? Well, do you feel that hasn't been taken into account in the? Well, if we've seen a reduction in basically in services, how do you? I find it difficult to believe that you can sort of expand services without a huge subsidy. Council or County Council, would you like to respond on that?
I mean, sorry. You go first.
All right. Yeah. Sorry. We've Mr. Small has put a note in on bus provision for the local plan growth. I know it's not accepted in yet, but it deals specifically with Winslow. I think the problem for you, ma'am, is it got the map that's with it has got emission sites on it, one in particular. So I don't know if we can show that, but it does deal. So through the pandemic, there's definitely been a consolidation of services, and there's a shortage of driver issues. But what I think Stagecoach will tell you is that they're concentrating their eggs in the basket, which is going to make the most viable routes, and that's why I think I'm speaking for Stagecoach, why they seem to be supporting better services through Winslow, because the A38 corridor naturally is an opportunity to have more frequent buses because people are travelling along it. I think that's, anyway, I'm not going to speak for Stagecoach. They've already given their representations, and but yeah, there has been a consolidation, but they're focusing on those routes which have better commercial viability potential.
Mr. Russell?
Just to add, obviously, you heard yesterday Stantec's proposals in consultation with stakeholders for diverting services, enhancing, increasing frequency of services. So clearly that would be a requirement. That is a requirement of the policy in terms of contributing to enhanced public transport services. So I suppose the answer would be where you have strategic sites which have the capacity and the ability to fund services, then you know, that's sadly, if there is a decline generally, then we would use the planning system to enhance the services that remain through contributions policies that you wouldn't necessarily, well, you certainly wouldn't get on small scale developments dotted around the district. So that's a kind of another justification for our spatial strategy around concentrating growth and to maximize the potential for new infrastructure to mitigate and indeed enhance the services for the wider area. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Butcher, your hand's still up. Have you got anything further you want to say?
It was about the walking and cycling routes. So it just triggered a thought based on yesterday and about the support of using developer contributions to develop or protect these routes. There was much mention of the Greenway and connecting Dursley with the Cam and Dursley station. The route doesn't currently exist. There are, and I accept entirely that where there are developments, they have put in place areas of the route, but there are large areas which are either going to have to use highways or are going to go across private land where they will convert a footpath. They've also got to cross a couple of streams where they'll need bridges and things. And I'm just concerned that there's an assumption made that this route's going to exist, but it's going to need a huge amount of investment. And to give you an example of the sort of, and cooperation from highways, and there are I think there's 3 major junctions on the road part of the route. One of which we've been waiting for 4 years even to get a design for a junction that will allow for cycling to go through. So I'm just wondering what commitment, you know, the cost that there will be to get this put in place in my lifetime. It will need a huge financial input and pressure from councils to get it done.
Council response?
Well, I mentioned earlier, and certainly the county council are leading on this, is the production of local cycling and walking investment plans, LC WIPs. The one has been produced for Stroud, and relatively recently one has been produced for Cam and Dursley area. And I say I won't put words into the county's mouths, but the basic purpose of these plans is to coordinate public investment and developer contributions to achieve that network. So we've already got investment through the existing adopted local plan for North East Cam, and we are proposing that the sites in the new local plan will contribute in that area. And the LC WIP provides the sort of the assurance, I suppose, that there will be there's a strategic approach to developing that network, and it's referenced in the local transport plan as well. So Mr. Butcher's concerns, I'm not going to sprinkle magic dust over it and say it's all going to be in place tomorrow, but we are using opportunities when we Mr. Drover mentioned recently about taking opportunities where we could in terms of the highway land to improve segregation from walking, cycling, and the road and car traffic. We have a cycling and walking investment budget as well, which is part of our SIL Community Infrastructure Levy fund. We are actively using that fund to fund infrastructure works along the strategic networks, and no doubt the cooperation will continue with the county council's team to deliver that. But yes, it will happen it'll happen incrementally when opportunities arise, rather than be a sort of a project which delivers it all at once. But I believe that certainly Cam and Dursley parish councils, town councils, are fully in support of that, the provision of that network, and hopefully Slimbridge Parish Council would be as well, although I understand their opposition to the Winslow development itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. Mr. Butcher, your hand's still up.
Well,
anything further?
Well, it's only that, as I've said, there's large tranches of it that are outside of any development or whatever, and there's part of it is going to run across some land, private land, that I don't see how the council have any what they can do about that.
Mr. Russell?
Well, again, I'm not going to get into specifics, but there are a range of options working. There are certainly parts of the strategic network where we are talking, and the county council are talking with landowners to secure provision of routes across third-party land. At the end of the day, there are opportunities through compulsory purchase as well. So there are funds available and different mechanisms for achieving the full network. But as I said, I'm not suggesting that the whole network is going to be delivered overnight. Thank you. But that's what plans are for after all 20-year plans. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fong.
Well, if I can, excuse me, if I can just help Mr. Ross a little bit. Firstly, the county council has got a very aspirational program of cycle paths, and it has to be admired. They're pushing out lots of good cycle paths across the county. Mr. Butcher mentioned the Greenway and how they're going to get hold of it. Just for example, Mr. Butcher, our clients in Wharton-under-Edge, Renishaw PLC and McMurtry Automotive have been approached by both the council and the parish councils about extending the Greenway. We as a landowner there are more than happy to ensure that Greenway is extended across their land gratis, so that aspiration of cycling and the gear change in trying to get people out of their cars is achieved. Now, yes, there will be a number of landowners along the way, but I think the county council and the district council are working hard to ensure that is delivered over time.
Thank you, Mr. Fong. What I'd like to do then, unless there are any further questions or queries are in relation to transport, is I'd like to draw the session to a close. So this is the last call for anybody, if anybody's got any. As I said, we will be discussing transport as part of the site allocations, I'm sure, in terms of the infrastructure, etc. Ms. McCaffrey, please.
Hi, thanks. Mine's more an admin point. I've got a meeting at 1 o'clock. I know you're probably about to pause for lunch.
I'm about to finish.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. I'll stop.
Okay, Thank you. So thank you very much, everybody. That's been really helpful. Back tomorrow dealing with 11A and 11C. So I shall see you again in the morning. So thank you for your contributions. I'll draw this to a close. Thank you.